Good afternoon. This is a 3 o'clock Liz Live. I'm trying out this time slot because I might change the time of the show because I'm really not a morning person, and there's so much to do here in Miami in the morning that I want to go biking and I want to go to the gym, and I don't know, I might change it, but we'll see. But good afternoon, happy Wednesday, and thank you for watching Liz Live. We have a very exciting topic today. And I feel like it's so important to talk about the word narrative because we're hearing the word narrative every moment on the news. Well, this is my narrative, and that's the narrative, and that's the narrative, and the narrative, and the narrative of systemic racism, the narrative of America, the free, and the Republican narrative, and the Democratic narrative, and the Black Lives Matter narrative, and I mean, we could go on and on and on with all of the different narratives. And this word's being thrown around a lot, and I don't even know if people really know what it means. What is a narrative? And a narrative, in the simplest terms, for all of you watching, is a story. It's a story that we tell. If you think about a narrator, someone who's, telling the story while you're watching a play or telling the story while you're watching a movie, they're storytellers, and we are all storytellers. Every single one of us is a storyteller, and we make stories up about who we are, about our identities, about our families, about our life experiences, about our beliefs. And when we are engaging in society, especially in today's world, we are engaging and listening to a bunch of narratives. The truth is very difficult to find these days because we have so many competing narratives, meaning narratives that are in direct competition with one another. So it gets very, very confusing. And people are sort of saying to themselves, well, how do I know the truth? How do I know what story to believe? How do I know what narrative is correct? And I think the answer is none. Zero are necessarily correct because it all depends on how we tell the story. I could tell you a story about my life right now, and you guys would think, wow, how sad. Elizabeth's had really, a very sad life. But I don't feel that I have a sad life. So I could tell you another narrative of my life, and you'd think it was the greatest life in the world. So it just depends on how we tell the story. And in therapy, we have different narratives that we tell. We story our lives. We make meaning of our lives. And there's a specific model of therapy called narrative therapy that I did study a bit in graduate school. And through that lens and understanding the narrative therapy model and really understanding what narratives are, stories are, I've been able to really sit back and look at the world in such a way where I see a bunch of stories, but I don't know that I see truth anywhere. And I think finding the truth these days is quite difficult, as I said earlier. So why does this matter? Why am I talking about this today? I mean, what's the point? Why is this important? And I think it's important for a lot of reasons, and I want to tie it into the opening song, which was Losing My Religion by REM. And I chose that song because understanding that stories that we tell, the stories we see on the news, the stories that we tell each other about ourselves, are somewhat identifying for us. And we identify and develop our identity by telling a story about our lives that may or may not even be true. It's a perspective. It's a perspective. It's not necessarily truth. It's your perspective and the way you made meaning of things that happened to you in your life. But it's important to, I think, look at the world through the lens of stories and storytelling for so many reasons, but because in many ways we are not being told the truth by our news media, by our politicians, by celebrities, by everybody that seems to have a microphone these days. And we internalize those stories and we believe them to be true. And then we're going out and we're treating people according to the narratives that we have in our minds, which may or may not be reality. So I think that for this conversation, for today's show, I want you guys to all kind of stop and think for a moment. What stories do I tell about my life? What stories, are they true? Are they not true? Are they a perspective? How does a story come to be? How do we link events to make them into a story? And I don't want to go too down the path of English or English literature, but yet at the same time, that's a very good framework for looking at what we're seeing go on before us in today's world, right? What stories do we tell ourselves about our relationships, about other people? I've met 5 or 6 people in a family that all have a different story about what growing up was like. And why is that? Well, that's because each person in the family was probably treated a little bit differently because they have a different, unique interaction with other people that other people, just because they're in the same house, maybe don't have. And because we choose how we make meaning of our story. So you might have those same 5 people who grew up in the same house, and they're going to have very different stories of their lives and their childhood. And I see it happen all the time, and it's quite fascinating. So I encourage all of you to think about that and think about when you're watching the news, wow, am I getting something that's actually truthful, or am I getting some sort of story here? Which is it? And it can be really quite eye-opening, quite an awakening when you start to see the world in stories. So if we go to the media, for example, okay, we literally have so many stories going on in the media because of politics that I wouldn't even know how to count. But I think that the important stories are the stories that each outlet tells, right? So we have the CNN story, we have the Fox News story, and then within that, we have the Tucker Carlson story, the Sean Hannity story, the Laura Ingraham story, the Shannon Bream story, the Greg Gutfeld story, the Harris, I forget her last name story, Dana Perino story, and I'm going through all the Fox people. And then we have the Don Lemon story, and we have the, I don't know the name, Rachel Maddow, and we have all of these journalists, and I put quotes around that because I don't know how much I consider them to be journalists. Some of them I do, some of them I don't. These, opinion editors, these storytellers, that's what these people are. There's nothing more than storytellers. And so when you're sitting and you're taking all of this in every night, and many of us tend to stick to the same author, right? We love the work of CNN, or we love the work of Fox News, we love the work of MSNBC, just like we like a good Danielle Steele story, right? So we tend to stick with the authors that we like. It makes sense to us. It agrees with our story that we grew up with, or that we live with, or we currently experience. And we say, yeah, that works for me, so I'm going to watch CNN, or I'm going to watch Fox, or I'm going to watch this. And then our stories may change as we grow and develop, and we may switch stories, and we may say, I'm a Wall Street Journal girl now. I used to read the Washington Post, and I'm a Fox News girl now, and I used to like MSNBC. Each network, each news outlet, each website, each human being tells their own story about what's happening in society today. And we don't even have objective journalism anymore. It doesn't take place. You have to look for it deeply embedded in the story. Okay, so if you're watching somebody that I think is really objective, his name is Brett Baer, and he does the 6 o'clock hour on Fox News. And, he might be somebody where you're going to get more journalism, meaning just reporting of things that happen. But even in reporting and journalism, which in my opinion does not exist anymore, anywhere at all, it's still a choice of how we're linking these events. I used to work in the news business. So I used to work, fires and all kinds of things. And I mean, I chose what I thought was important to report about those particular moments and about those particular stories, and I became the storyteller. And so we all have to keep in mind that we are a reader of the story. We are a witness of human drama, but we are not necessarily the human drama itself. It's kind of a deep thought. Tie that into the song of Losing My Religion. Facing the truth, or trying to find the truth, searching for truth, is quite difficult these days. And I don't know that it exists anywhere, to be quite honest with you, at this point. Things are so convoluted and so messy and so conflicting and conflictual that it's very difficult to even, begin to attempt to try to find the truth. We just find the truths, the stories, again, that make the most sense to us, that agree with our religion, with our conditioning, with the way that we were conditioned and raised to believe. Probably, if you think about what your political beliefs are, they probably are somewhat similar to your parents' political views, or they might be similar to all your friends that grew up, or the people in your neighborhood, or the company that you keep, right? Because we tend to gather with other people that agree with our story, that share the common story. So it's not as likely that you would find, someone who is very conservative hanging out with a bunch of liberals, or a bunch of liberals hanging out with a bunch of conservatives. And why is that? It's only because of the story, because their stories don't match. They don't interconnect in their minds, just like a religion, right? So when REM's talking about losing my religion, and that's me in the corner, that's me in the spotlight, losing my religion, it's so scary when you're stripped of all of your beliefs about the world. It's so scary when you're stripped about all the beliefs about yourself and about your family and about your relationships, that we go, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to stick to my story. Just like I'm going to stick to my religion, right? So if you were raised a Christian and you believe in Jesus Christ and the story of Jesus, and you've been hearing that all of your life, everyone you hung out with, you grew up in the church, and that's the story that you live every day. If somebody comes along and says, hey, that's not true, that never happened, that's just a story, that literally will strip you of your identity, of your religion, of every belief that you have based your life upon. And people don't want to entertain that. They don't want to go there, because then they're stripped naked, and they say, well, if that didn't happen, then what does that mean about the way I look at everything, right? And the same goes, I don't mean to be, picking on Christianity. It's just something that popped into my head. But we have Judaism, we have, Hinduism and Taoism and Buddhism and Islam. And we have lots of isms, right? We could go on and on. And all of these world religions think they're right, but they're just a story. They're a story. They're a bunch of stories, actually, put together to create sort of an idea of how we may be living, we may consider living our lives. They're not actually truth. There's no proof that really any of these stories actually happened. We can go through history and find some of the locations, and we can trace some, artifacts perhaps, if we really get into it, but there's no proof of any of it. It's just a bunch of stories. And that is the same thing with what we're hearing in the news. The news is somewhat based in, or supposed to be based in, things that are actually happening in the moment, and then reporting back to all of us, audience people that are just taking in the story. But again, the interpretation, the perspective is subjective, meaning it is going to be different depending on your perspective and your viewpoint. Okay, so Elizabeth, you're talking all this philosophy today. You know, what does it mean for me? Why do I care about this? Why are you going on and on about all of this? And I think the reason I'm going on and on about this is because I'm so distraught over what I'm seeing going on in the world and what I'm being shown in the human drama that I see on the news and on the internet and social media. I'm so disturbed by the human stories that are being told that I felt like I needed to say something to the people that watch the show to say, you know, remember, these are nothing more than human stories. And we, the observer of these stories, of this human drama, we get to decide whether we agree to it or we don't agree to it, or if it's just a perspective. And we don't have to absorb these stories as a definition of our identity or who we are or what we stand for. Because in doing so, we are warring with each other. And we're warring with each other in this country right now over, I mean, like potatoes, in the sense that, I mean, what does she mean by that? Like, we're warring over some an insignificant thing that we don't even know that it's happening or not. So we don't even understand its contribution because it's being storied for us. So unless you want to really get on the ground and go around the country and really do some, you know, good sound research and really analyze and study statistics that are available to us, you really have, you know, not a lot to talk about as anything being truthful. You only have an opinion. And I think it's so important because we shouldn't be hating each other or dismissing each other over a particular story that somebody's choosing to tell or a story that somebody's choosing to buy into, because there are many, many stories. I could tell 15 right now that are going on in the news, right? One of the ones that we're hearing so much about right now is, you know, systemic racism. And I keep hearing politicians throw this word around and news reporters throwing this word around and, you know, speakers throwing this word around. And I'm thinking, do you guys even know what that means? Because the way you're using it isn't even in the proper context half the time. So when you say that there's systemic racism in America, can you define exactly what you mean? Because there's a lot of interpretations and a lot of ways to understand systemic racism. Do you mean it's in all systems that are governmental? Do you mean it's in all systems, period? Do you mean it's in a pattern of systems and trickles down to everybody? You know, where does it come from? Who are the systems? And I never hear the answer to any of this. All I hear is systemic racism. It's everywhere. The country is systemically racist. Maybe it is. Define it for me, because I have no idea really what anybody means when they say that. I know my story and my definition of systemic racism that I studied in graduate school, but I have no idea if that's the same definition that anybody out there is talking about, or if they even know what they're talking about. And the people who don't believe that there's systemic racism, because, you know, again, I have no idea. I'm not making a comment one way or the other because I don't even know what people mean when they say it, because no one's really defining it. They're just throwing it out there, this word, because it seems so powerful. And it is powerful. The word racist is a powerful word, period. You know, so those of you who do not believe that there's systemic racism in the country, what do you mean by that? I mean, I would like to know what people really mean, and no one's really being challenged, no one's really being asked, nobody's really being told. And so we just kind of sit around and we listen to all these stories and all this information, and we have absolutely no idea what anyone's talking about, and we just go, yep, that's true, I agree with that story, and now I'm going to go hate all, you know, people of this color or that color, or I'm going to think that all people who do this are stupid or do that or whatever. And then we just have like a big old, you know, big mess. So Am I making sense? It's everyone. I hope so. I hope so. So again, we have it as an important issue in society. We have it as an important issue in our relationships and our lives. And I want to talk a little bit about that. So why are stories important? Why is the narrative of our life important? Well, it's important because just like what we see and we hear and we watch on the news and we go, yeah, I agree with that. We may be also buying into other people's stories of who we are and going, yeah, that's true. I am that story. When in fact, you're not that story, or it doesn't feel right when you hear somebody tell that story about you, but you have agreed to that story your whole life. So you don't know what to do or where to go with it. And it's confusing. So by restoring your life, you can restory your relationships. You can restory the way that you look at yourself. You can restory your identity, and you can restory your future, all by refusing to go along with the stories that people tell. There's a dominant story happening right now in the news. We hear the dominant story of, that everybody's, everyone should believe the sort of story that's dominant. I call it the dominant story. What is the dominant story? The dominant story is that we live in a racist country. Trump's insane. Anyone who votes for Trump is a racist. Anyone who doesn't go along with the left is a racist. That's a dominant story. And the reason I call it dominant is because it's the one being told the most. It's the one that most networks and newspapers write and speak about and tell. So when most of the outlets that you trust, that you believe in, are telling these stories and you go, yep, that's true. That's my favorite news anchor on ABC and I've been watching him for 20 years. And if he says it, then I know it's true. Then, okay, yep. And then you believe it. And then you act accordingly. And the way we're acting is really bad. We're acting in constant conflict with one another because we have this large group of people that believe in the dominant story. And then we have I think it's a smaller group, it may be equal number of people, but we have maybe one news or two, maybe three tops news outlets telling a different story that's not dominant. And you have this battle and this conflict. Just imagine how the stories could be shaping our relationships, our families, our lives, our self-love, the things that we do, and the way that we treat other people, and the things we won't do, and the things we're afraid of, just simply by believing in a false narrative or a narrative that somebody else wrote about us, and we went, I believe that to be true. It's scary if you think about it. If you really stop and look at your life, if you can be an observer of your own life, which is, very difficult to do, but if you can step back and be an observer of your life, what would you see outside of it? Would you see the same story that you see right here, right now? I doubt it. Because you'd be looking at it from a different perspective. Just to share a personal story along those lines, I've lived in North Miami prior to this for about 14 years. And in those 14 years, I drove the same streets over and over again and went to some of the same restaurants and had the same life and did some of the same things. And then I moved up north for, about 7 years. And I recently moved back to the same town in Miami, in North Miami. And on Sunday, I went for a beautiful bike ride with my brother through the same streets of North Miami that I've driven thousands of times. And I did it on a bike, which I never did before. So you have a whole different perspective. It's actually much more beautiful riding a bike because you get to really see the beauty of the water and the boats and the sky and the sunshine. And I never saw my neighborhood from that perspective. I never saw it from riding a bike. I never saw it that way. So all of a sudden I saw it from a different perspective, and it was so beautiful and magnificent. I couldn't believe that I never saw it like this before. Never saw it this way before. And the only difference really in my perspective today than 7 or 8 years ago was the way in which I was traveling, right? I was traveling by bike instead of by car. And I was with, my brother, which we never did that before together in this area. And we went places and we traveled into little nooks and crannies with our bikes that we couldn't have done by car, or even probably would have never made it on foot. And so this whole new world opened up to me just by going on bike instead of going on in a car. Just by keeping a little bit of a different company, or just by, age, it's an experience itself, being open to a new experience, right? So I think there's a moral in that story that's so important, that we miss so much. We miss so much of our lives by buying into that story that's being told. We miss so much beauty. We miss so much experience because we just accept what other people are saying about us or telling about us, rather than making our own stories about ourselves according to who we believe we are and who we think we are. We tell stories of our past relationships in a way in which suits us. We don't necessarily tell the real story. We leave out the ugly parts a lot. We leave out the parts that we're accountable for, right? I mean, why would we put that in the story? Very few of us do that. So we lie to ourselves through our stories. We lie to other people through our stories. But we could be doing things very productive through our stories, right? If we can mislead and deceive and lie through our stories, we can also be truthful and be free in our stories as well. We can see things from a new perspective. We can see things with different eyes, and we can agree to a different story and make some really serious change in our lives. Changes that you never thought were possible, all because of how we story things, all because of the way we speak about ourselves and we speak about our past. Many of us are trapped in our past, right? We haven't let go of some of the stories we tell from the past. So like an old dusty book, we just sit on the shelf and we just go, yeah, that was the story. That's what happened. My life was miserable. My husband cheated on me, and he's an asshole, and excuse me, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to swear, but, now my life is, terrible. Well, that's the story you're telling. I mean, that's what you're choosing to see. That's what you're choosing to talk about, but that's definitely not the whole story, right? And all of us therapists know that's never the whole story. There's always many parts to the story, and there's at least 2 parts because there's 2 people, and there's usually a lot more. So what have you been lying to yourself about? What have you been deceiving other people about? What have you been projecting onto other people because you don't want to take accountability for things in your life story? And how can you change that life story to make it what you want and tell the story about yourself that you're proud of, and to redefine your identity through a new story, and to not get sucked into the dominant story, the story of the human drama being played out every day on the news, and the drama being played out to make us almost robotic and believe and go, yeah, I agree with CNN. I agree with ABC. I trust those people. They're trustworthy. I trust that network. Well, let me tell you, I don't know why you would really trust any network, because they're all run by their advertiser dollars, and even within that, each person and producer and executive producer and news director has a say-so in how that story is told. So I'm not sure about believing in stories. I would listen to stories, multiple stories. You can seek truth. I don't know that you're going to find it unless you go out and investigate on your own and see things for your own eyes, which is why I always encourage people to listen to press conferences yourselves, the whole thing, not just the sound bites that create this fun little story for everyone to go, oh my God, she said that, he said, I can't believe it. But doing this stuff feels like you're losing your religion. And that's why I opened with the REM song, because you are literally losing the identification that you have bought into, that you have chosen to believe about yourself, about God, about the world, about, the politics. And when you have to strip away all those storylines and look at the raw material, which is probably the closest thing to the truth, the raw material, not how do you find raw material anymore, it's very difficult, then you have to face that you've been kind of fooling yourself or just lying to yourself to make yourself feel better and not take accountability and say, oh, my life is such a mess, I could never fix it, and it's all that person's fault. Or, we're all fighting because the news media is, making us hate each other. Well, there's probably some truth to that, but we don't have to buy into it. We don't have to buy into it. We don't have to buy their stories, their narratives. So the next time you hear the word narrative being used on the news, the next time that you hear a politician throw out the word narrative, now you'll actually know kind of what they mean, and you will kind of have a mind open enough to say, from whence and where is coming this narrative. It's their story, it's not my story. I don't believe in that. I don't believe that that's true. I'm seeing this, but you're telling me that. And I'm going to stick to what I see with my own eyes, not what you're telling me I'm seeing, right? The reinterpretation, the story, the narratives that are coming at us constantly from our neighbors, our schools, our news media, our politicians, our leadership, okay? Our celebrities, our podcasters, our talk show hosts, everybody who's got one of these is telling a story. And I'm telling a story myself today, I'm telling you my story. I'm telling you what I see and what I believe. I'm not saying it's true. I'm not saying it's right. I think it's reasonable. I think it's fair. And I think it is true that everybody has a story and that it's just their story. But I'm not necessarily telling you to believe in my story, because my story belongs to me and you don't have to agree to it. And we don't have to agree to anybody else's story out there if it doesn't feel right for us. There's nothing more precious than the gift of independent thinking. So be careful about getting sucked into other people's stories. Be aware of all the different stories that are coming at you, and be aware of how that's influencing you and the work that you do and the beliefs that you have and the way that you're treating people in your personal life, in your work life, your professional life, your social life, and then some. Because all of this conflict and shootings and violence and horror that's going on in our country right now is all coming out of one story being told. That's it. It all boils down to that. So let's rise above that story, and let's listen and respect different stories, and let's not identify and judge each other based on the stories we tell or believe, but let's go beyond the story and cut through the conflict. And only then can we somewhat begin to have a healing and peaceful experience of the United States today. And I'm going to leave it there because I feel like I left it on a good note. Okay? So, Saturday morning, 11 a.m., back to usual, Liz Live, and we'll be talking about some very interesting things that are happening in the world today. And like and share this story with other people, and let's not buy into the dominant story. Let's write our own story that makes sense for us, and a story that is loving and accepts other stories, other people's stories as well. If you need help discovering your story, rewriting your story, telling your story, you can always call me for therapy. I am open and taking appointments in Miami now. And you can look for my contact information right on this page right here. Have a great afternoon, everybody. See you Saturday morning at 11 a.m.